Have you ever wondered how a language that had never been written down became the most powerful weapon the United States ever deployed against an enemy that seemed unstoppable? How could ancient words, spoken by men whose ancestors were hunted and persecuted, turn the tide of the bloodiest war in the Pacific? Before we dive into this story that was buried in classified files for decades, I need your help. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. This channel depends on you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. This content was never meant to be public, and we need your support to continue revealing what they tried to keep secret. The year was 1942, and the Empire of Japan was an unstoppable force carving through the Pacific like a blade through paper. Island after island fell: Manila, Singapore, Guam, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies. Every strategic point, every naval fortress, every Allied stronghold crumbled under the coordinated fury of Japanese bombers, naval artillery, and ground forces that moved with mechanical precision. American intelligence officers sat in underground bunkers in Pearl Harbor and San Diego, staring at maps that showed nothing but rising sun flags spreading like a contagion across the ocean. The intercepted Japanese communications were flawless, encrypted with a complexity that made even the most experienced cryptographers weep with frustration. In a smoke-filled room in Washington, D.C., Major General Clayton Vogel stood before a map so covered in red markers that the blue of the Pacific Ocean had nearly disappeared. His hands trembled not from fear, but from rage tempered by exhaustion. 48 hours without sleep. 3 different encryption teams had failed to break the latest Japanese naval code. American ships were being ambushed with such precision that it seemed the enemy was reading their orders before they were even transmitted. "They know where we're going before we do," Vogel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. 6 intelligence officers, 2 Navy commanders, and a Marine Corps liaison sat around the heavy oak table, their faces illuminated by the dim yellow light of a single lamp. Outside, Washington prepared for another day of rationing and fear. Inside this room, they were losing a war that had barely begun. It was Commander William Friedman who spoke next, a brilliant cryptanalyst whose eyes carried the weight of impossible problems. "Sir, every code we've developed has been compromised within weeks. The Japanese have interpreters who studied at Berkeley, Harvard, Stanford. They speak English better than most Americans. They've infiltrated our communication networks so deeply that we might as well be broadcasting in the clear." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, from the back of the room, a voice emerged. Rough, weathered, belonging to a man who looked out of place among the pressed uniforms and military decorum. Philip Johnston was not a soldier. He was a civil engineer, the son of missionaries, a man who had spent his childhood on Navajo reservations in the scorched deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. He stood slowly, his presence commanding attention not through rank, but through the certainty in his voice. "There's a language," Johnston said, "that no Japanese interpreter will ever understand. No cryptographer will ever break, because it's never been written down. It exists only in the minds of a people who have guarded it for centuries." The room turned toward him. General Vogel's expression shifted from exhaustion to something resembling desperate hope. "What language?" "Navajo." The word hung in the air like a strange incantation. Several officers exchanged glances. One laughed nervously, then stopped when he saw Johnston's face remain deadly serious. "You want us to trust our military communications to Indians?" a Navy commander asked, his tone dripping with skepticism that barely masked contempt. "The same Indians we put on reservations. The same ones whose children we forced into boarding schools to beat their language out of them? Johnston stepped forward, his jaw tight. Those same Indians, Commander, speak a language with syntax so complex that linguistic scholars at Yale and Columbia have called it one of the most difficult on Earth. It has no alphabet, no written form, and its structure is completely alien to any Asian or European language. A single Navajo word can contain more grammatical information than an entire English sentence. The Japanese have the finest code breakers in the world, but they've never heard Navajo. They don't even know it exists. General Vogel leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. How do you know this? Because I grew up speaking it. I lived among the Diné people. I know their warriors, and I know that if you give me permission, I can bring you men who will turn this war around. 3 weeks later, a telegram arrived at the Navajo reservation in Window Rock, Arizona. It was addressed to the Tribal Council, written in English, stamped with official military seals that meant nothing to most of the people who lived in the scattered hogans across the red desert landscape. But word spread quickly, carried by runners and traders, by grandmothers and medicine men, until it reached a small settlement near Chinle, where a man named Chester Nez was repairing a fence under the merciless afternoon sun. Chester was 20 years old, thin and wiry, with hands scarred from years of ranch work. He had been sent to boarding school as a child, one of thousands of Navajo children forcibly removed from their families and placed in government institutions designed to kill the Indian, save the man. They had cut his hair, burned his traditional clothes, beaten him when he spoke his own language. For 6 years, he had been told that everything about his people was savage, primitive, worthless. Now, the same government wanted that language back, wanted it desperately, needed it to survive. Chester's grandmother sat in the shade of their hogan, her face a map of wrinkles that told stories of survival through drought, disease, and persecution. She spoke in Navajo, her voice like wind over ancient stone. They take everything from us. Our land, our children, our sacred places. Now they want our words, too. Chester looked toward the horizon, where the sacred mountains rose against the burning sky. Grandmother, if I can use our language to protect our people, to protect this land, isn't that what a warrior does? She was silent for a long time. Then she reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his sun-darkened skin. You carry the voices of our ancestors. Don't let them silence you again. 29 men reported to Fort Wingate, New Mexico, in May of 1942. 29 Navajo volunteers, most barely out of their teens, some still carrying the psychological scars of boarding schools, others who had never left the reservation. They arrived in old trucks, on horseback, some walking miles through the desert with nothing but a canteen and a letter from the Marine Corps. The Marines who met them at the gate didn't know what to make of these quiet, weathered young men who looked more comfortable under open sky than inside barracks. The training was brutal. Not the combat training, which they endured with stoic determination, but the impossible task they'd been given. Create an unbreakable military code using a language that had no words for tank, bomber, submarine, or artillery. How do you describe modern warfare in a tongue that evolved to speak of corn harvests, lightning, coyotes, and the movement of stars? They gathered in a sweltering barracks room, the 29 original code talkers, with maps and military manuals spread before them. A young Marine linguist named Robert Johnson stood at the front, his face flushed with frustration. Gentlemen, we need you to develop code words for over 400 military terms. Ships, aircraft, weapons, tactical maneuvers, and we need it done in 3 weeks. Chester Nez looked at the others. Some were his relatives. Others he'd known since childhood. They had grown up with stories of how their people had survived impossible odds, how they had walked 300 miles during the long walk, how they had endured years of imprisonment at Bosque Redondo. This was just another impossible thing. They began that night. The work was sacred, though the Marines would never understand why. Each word they chose was deliberate, poetic, drawn from the natural world that had sustained their ancestors. A bomber became Jai-Sho, the buzzard, because it flew high and brought death. A submarine became Besh-Lo, iron fish, because it swam beneath the waves like the fish in Canyon de Chelly. A battleship became Lotso, whale, because of its size and power. Fighter planes were Dahetihi, hummingbirds, because of their speed and agility. But it was more than simple substitution. They created a phonetic alphabet where each English letter was represented by a Navajo word. A was Wallachi, ant. B was shush, bear. C was moasi, cat. And because the code needed to be unbreakable even if the alphabet was discovered, they created multiple words for frequently used letters. The letter E alone had 12 different Navajo equivalents. Within 3 weeks, they had built something that would baffle Japanese cryptographers for the entire war. A code within a language within a code. Words that could be spoken at conversational speed, but would take a team of American cryptographers hours to decode even with the key. Messages that could be transmitted in 20 seconds that would have taken 30 minutes using standard encryption machines. The first field test came in August of 1942, during the Battle for Guadalcanal. The Japanese held the island with fanatical determination, their positions so well fortified that every American advance was measured in yards and paid for in blood. Communication was chaos. Every radio transmission was intercepted, every encoded message broken, every tactical movement anticipated. Marines died because the enemy knew they were coming. Then Chester Nez and 5 other Navajo code talkers arrived on the beach under cover of darkness, their radios strapped to their backs, their rifles loaded, their voices carrying words that no enemy could comprehend. The commanding officer, Colonel Samuel Griffith, was skeptical to the point of hostility. He looked at these quiet Native American Marines and saw nothing that inspired confidence. "You boys better not get us killed," Griffith said, his Virginia accent thick with exhaustion and doubt. "We've lost 100 men in the last 48 hours because every goddamn order we send gets intercepted." Chester looked the colonel in the eye, his expression calm. "Sir, send any message you want. We'll transmit it. The Japanese won't understand a word." The first transmission went out at 0400 hours, an order for artillery support, coordinates, timing, number of rounds. Chester spoke in rapid Navajo, his voice steady despite the artillery fire that shook the ground beneath his feet. On the receiving end, another Navajo code talker translated instantly, relayed the message to the gun crews. 90 seconds later, shells began falling on Japanese positions with devastating accuracy. The Japanese radio operators heard the transmission. They recorded it, played it back, analyzed it with the same meticulous attention they had used to break every other Allied code. But what they heard made no linguistic sense. It wasn't English spoken with an accent. It wasn't any Asian language. It wasn't even human in the way they understood human speech. The tonal quality, the rhythm, the structure, it was as if the Americans had suddenly begun speaking in a language from another world. In Tokyo, the Imperial Intelligence Service assembled their finest cryptographers. They brought in linguists who spoke 20 languages. They consulted with scholars of indigenous cultures. They played the recordings until the tape wore thin. Nothing. One analyst wrote in his report, "The Americans are using a code based on an unknown language with no recognizable patterns. It is unlike anything in our experience. We cannot break it. We cannot even identify it." By September, 60 more Navajo recruits had been trained. By December, over 200 code talkers were deployed across the Pacific Theater. They fought at Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They landed with the first wave of Marines, carrying their radios into hell, speaking their ancient language while bombs fell and bullets screamed through the air. They transmitted orders for naval bombardments, called in airstrikes, coordinated troop movements, all in words that their grandmothers had taught them around cooking fires in the desert. The Japanese tried everything. They captured a Navajo soldier, a man named Joe Kiyumiya, who had been serving with the army in the Philippines. They tortured him for weeks, demanding that he translate the strange language they'd intercepted. But Joe had never been trained as a code talker. He spoke Navajo, but he didn't know the code. Even if he had wanted to help his captors, even under torture that broke bones and tore skin, he couldn't have told them what J-Sho or Beshlo meant in the military context. The code was spoken by fewer than 400 men in the entire world, and only they knew its secrets. Major Howard Connor, signal officer for the 5th Marine Division, would later write in his report, "Without the Navajo code talkers, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. So, during the first 48 hours of that battle, the code talkers transmitted over 800 messages without a single error. 800 messages that directed artillery, coordinated airstrikes, called for medical evacuations, adjusted naval gunfire. 800 messages that saved countless American lives and broke the back of Japanese resistance. But there was something else happening, something that the official reports would never fully capture. The code talkers were doing more than transmitting orders. They were warriors in the oldest sense, carrying not just weapons, but the weight of their people's survival. Every word they spoke in combat was a prayer, a connection to ancestors who had fought different battles, but with the same determination. When Chester Nez called in coordinates for an airstrike, he was speaking words that his grandfather had used to describe the movement of eagles over Canyon de Chelly. When Thomas Begay transmitted orders during the brutal fighting on Saipan, he was using a language that had been forbidden in his childhood, beaten out of children in government schools, declared savage and primitive by the same government that now depended on it for survival. The irony was not lost on them. These men who had been told their culture was worthless were now the most valuable assets the Marine Corps possessed. These men who had been forced onto reservations, denied citizenship, forbidden from voting in their own states, were now fighting and dying for a country that had never treated them as equals. And they did it anyway, because they were warriors, because their ancestors had endured worse, because they understood something that the generals and politicians never fully grasped. This was their land too. These were their people too, and they would defend it with every word, every breath, every drop of blood. The code was never broken. Not once. Not in 3 years of desperate warfare. The Japanese never even came close. And when the war ended, when the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when the emperor finally surrendered, the Navajo code talkers returned to their reservations in silence. The code was still classified. They couldn't tell their families what they'd done. They couldn't share their stories. They couldn't even mention that they'd been code talkers. Chester Nez went back to Window Rock, to the same hogan where his grandmother had blessed him before he left. He carried wounds that would never fully heal, not from bullets, but from the things he'd seen, the friends he'd lost, the terrible weight of keeping secrets that defined his entire youth. His grandmother looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering, and she asked him only one question in Navajo. "Did you bring our words back home?" He nodded, unable to speak. Because he had. He had taken their language into the darkest places on Earth, had used it to survive, had proven that what the government tried to destroy was actually the thing that saved them all. But the silence was its own kind of torture. For 23 years, the code remained classified. For 23 years, the code talkers lived with the knowledge that they had changed history, but they couldn't claim it. They watched as other heroes were celebrated, as parades marched through towns, as monuments were built. They said nothing. It wasn't until 1968 that the code was finally declassified. By then, many of the original 29 had died, taking their stories to graves marked only with simple stones. Chester Nez lived long enough to see his people honored, to watch as museums displayed the code, as schools taught children about the unbreakable language. He lived to be 93 years old, and until the day he died, he could still transmit military orders in Navajo at conversational speed, the words flowing from his mouth like water over ancient rock. But here's what they don't tell you in the museums, what the sanitized histories leave out. The code talkers came home to a country that still denied them basic rights. They came home to states where they couldn't vote, to towns where they weren't allowed in certain restaurants, to a society that celebrated them in press releases but wouldn't let them buy land off the reservation. They had saved thousands of American lives, had helped win the most important war in modern history, and they came home to segregation, poverty, and the same discrimination that had existed before they left. Some of them turned to alcohol to silence the screams that echoed in their minds. Some killed themselves quietly, alone in the desert, their bodies found days later by relatives who would never understand why. The government gave them medals, shook their hands for photographs, then sent them back to reservations where running water was still a luxury, and education was still designed to erase their identity. There's a file in the National Archives, declassified only in 2002, that contains something disturbing. It's a report written by a Marine Corps psychiatrist in 1946, documenting the psychological state of returning code talkers. The doctor's name was Captain Richard Beaumont, and his observations were so troubling that the report was buried for over 50 years. In it, he describes interviews with 12 different code talkers who had returned to the Navajo Nation. What he found wasn't just post-traumatic stress. It was something deeper, more complex. These men, Beaumont wrote, display symptoms unlike any combat veterans I have treated. They speak of carrying two wars, one against the Japanese, one against the erasure of their identity. Several described feeling as though they had become weapons themselves, their language militarized, their words turned into instruments of death. One subject, whom I will call Subject 7, told me that he can no longer speak Navajo without seeing the faces of men dying from the coordinates he transmitted. He said his grandmother's prayers now sound like artillery calculations. He asked me if it was possible to have your soul broken in a language no doctor can understand. Subject 7 was Thomas Begay, a code talker who had fought at Iwo Jima, Saipan, and Okinawa. He had transmitted over 3,000 combat messages, had called in airstrikes that killed hundreds of Japanese soldiers, had coordinated naval bombardments that turned entire hillsides into smoking craters. He was 24 years old when he came home. He lived in a small trailer outside Shiprock, New Mexico, worked odd jobs, never married, never spoke about the war. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who sometimes stood outside at night, staring at the stars, his lips moving silently as if in prayer or conversation with ghosts only he could see. In 1973, Thomas Begay walked into the desert near the Chuska Mountains with a canteen of water and his old Marine Corps knife. He was found 3 days later by a group of sheep herders, dead from dehydration and exposure, the knife still in its sheath. Next to his body, scratched into the red sand with a stick, were Navajo words that the sheep herders couldn't fully understand. They were code words, military terms: Jaysho, Beshlo, Kelichogi, Neyasja. Buzzard, ironfish, artillery, owl, which meant observation plane in the code. He had been writing the code in the sand over and over, as if trying to leave behind the weight he'd carried for 30 years, as if the desert might absorb what his mind could no longer hold. But Thomas Begay's story is just one thread in a larger, more disturbing pattern that nobody talks about. Because there's something else buried in those classified files, something that suggests the code didn't just win battles. It changed the men who spoke it in ways that the military never anticipated and never tried to understand. In 1956, a Navajo medicine man named John Benally reported something strange to the tribal council. He had been conducting traditional healing ceremonies for several code talkers who were suffering from what he called ghost sickness, a condition where the spirits of the dead attach themselves to the living. During these ceremonies, all performed in Navajo, several of the veterans began speaking in what Benally described as battle language. They would suddenly shift from prayer to military transmissions, calling out coordinates, reporting enemy positions, requesting fire support, all in the hybrid Navajo code that shouldn't exist outside of combat. It was as if, Benally wrote in a letter that was discovered in tribal archives, the war had followed them home and was living inside their words. They could not separate the sacred language from the killing language. When they tried to pray, they transmitted death. When they spoke to their children, artillery coordinates slipped into lullabies. The code had become part of their spirit in a way that could not be cleansed. The Tribal Council forwarded Benally's concerns to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which forwarded them to the Department of Defense, which classified the report and filed it away. No investigation was conducted. No support was offered. The code talkers were left to carry their burden alone, caught between two worlds, speaking a language that had saved a nation but was slowly destroying them from within. By the 1980s, journalists began trying to document the code talkers' experiences, but they found something unexpected. Many of the surviving code talkers refused to speak about certain aspects of their service, not because of lingering classification concerns. The code had been public for over a decade by then, but because of something else, something they wouldn't name. A reporter named Sarah Chen spent 6 months on the Navajo reservation in 1987, interviewing code talkers for a book project. In her unpublished notes, now housed at the University of New Mexico, she describes a conversation with a man she identifies only as Informant C. "We sat in his living room," Chen wrote, "and he showed me his medals, his photographs, his discharge papers. He was proud of his service, emotional about his fallen friends, but when I asked him about the actual experience of using the code in combat, his demeanor changed completely. He became agitated, stood up, walked to the window. He said something in Navajo that I couldn't understand, then turned to me and said, 'There are things we did with our language that should never have been done. Words are sacred. They have power. We took that power and used it to kill. You ask me what it was like. I'll tell you. It was like taking your mother's prayers and turning them into bullets. It worked. God help us, it worked. But there's a price for using sacred things as weapons. We're still paying it.'" Chen tried to follow up with Informant C several times, but he refused further interviews. 6 months later, she learned he had died in his sleep. He was 68 years old, in good health, No known medical conditions. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but Chen noted something disturbing in her final entry about him. His daughter told me that in the days before his death, her father had stopped speaking English entirely. He spoke only in Navajo, and she said he seemed to be having conversations with people who weren't there. She said he kept repeating the same phrases over and over, words she recognized as his grandmother's prayers mixed with terms she didn't understand. She recorded some of it on a tape recorder, thinking it might be important. When I listened to the tape, I recognized some of the words from my research on the code. He was transmitting, calling for fire support, reporting casualties, requesting evacuation. In his final days, he had returned to the war, and the war was speaking through him in a language that bridged the living and the dead. The tape Chen referenced was never found. Her book was never published. She moved to California, stopped researching the topic entirely, and when asked about it years later, she would only say that she felt she had been trespassing on something that wasn't meant to be understood by outsiders. But the pattern continued. Throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, as the original code talkers aged and died, their families reported similar phenomena. Veterans who, in their final weeks or days, would suddenly begin speaking the code again, not in moments of clarity or remembrance, but in states of delirium or semi-consciousness, as if the language they had used in combat was etched so deeply into their neural pathways that it emerged when all other faculties failed. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator but a neurolinguist at Stanford who studied bilingual veterans in 2008, documented something remarkable. She was researching how trauma affects language processing in multilingual combat veterans, and she interviewed several Navajo code talkers as part of her study. What she found challenged everything she thought she knew about how the brain processes language under extreme stress. Normal bilingual individuals, Dr. Warren explained in her research paper, show clear separation between their languages in brain imaging. The neural pathways for English activate in different regions than, say, Spanish or Mandarin. But when I scanned the brains of code talkers while they performed linguistic tasks, something extraordinary appeared. The Navajo language regions and the combat memory regions were deeply interconnected in ways I've never seen in any other population. More disturbing, when I had them listen to recordings of military orders in English, their Navajo language centers activated simultaneously. The code had essentially fused their native language with combat trauma at a neurological level. The language and the war had become inseparable in their brains. Dr. Warren's research was published in a neurolinguistics journal with limited circulation. She tried to expand her study, to bring in more code talkers, to understand the full implications of what she'd discovered. But the Department of Defense denied her request for access to additional veterans, citing privacy concerns. The Navajo Nation was more direct. The Tribal Council asked her to stop. One council member told her, off the record, "You're studying something that goes beyond science. These men gave up more than their youth in that war. They gave up something essential about their relationship with our language. Some wounds aren't meant to be examined. They're meant to be carried with dignity until the end." She stopped her research, but in her private notes, later donated to Stanford's archives, she wrote, "I believe the code talkers experienced a form of linguistic trauma that has no parallel in medical literature. They were asked to take a language that defined their identity, their culture, their spiritual connection to their ancestors, and transform it into a weapon. The psychological cost of that transformation cannot be measured by conventional metrics. These men didn't just serve their country. They sacrificed something fundamental about who they were, and they did it so completely that it changed the architecture of their minds." By 2014, only a handful of the original code talkers remained alive. Chester Nez died that year at 93, one of the last surviving members of the original 29. His funeral was attended by Marines from across the country, by Navajo elders, by government officials who gave speeches about heroism and sacrifice. But something happened during the ceremony that didn't make it into the official reports. As Chester's body was being blessed by a medicine man using prayers in Navajo that dated back centuries, several of the surviving code talkers who were in attendance began to weep uncontrollably. Not quiet tears of grief, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal sorrow. One of them, a man named Roy Hawthorne, had to be helped outside. His grandson, Marcus, who served in Iraq with the army, later described what happened. "My grandfather couldn't stop crying," Marcus said in an interview with a tribal newspaper. He kept saying in Navajo that the language was dying, that when Chester died, something else died too. I asked him what he meant, and he looked at me with these eyes that were just broken. He said, "We made our language into a code. We made our prayers into coordinates for killing. We did it to save lives, and we did. But we also did something we can never undo. We changed what it means to speak Navajo. Every code talker carries that change inside them, and when we're all gone, no one will understand what we gave up. They'll celebrate the code, build monuments to it, teach it in schools. But they'll never know the price. They'll never know that every word we spoke in battle was a word we could never speak innocently again." Roy Hawthorne died 6 months later. In his will, he left a letter to be opened by the tribal council after his death. The letter, written in English because, as he noted, some things are too painful to say in Navajo, contained a request that has never been made public in full, but portions of it were leaked to journalists in 2016. In the letter, Hawthorne asked the tribal council to consider whether the Navajo language should ever be used for military purposes again. He acknowledged the pride the nation felt in the code talkers' contribution, but he urged future generations to understand that there had been consequences that went beyond the visible wounds of war. "We were honored to serve," Hawthorne wrote. "We were proud to use our language to protect our people and our country. But I must tell you the truth, that we code talkers rarely spoke about among ourselves. Using Navajo as a weapon changed the language for us. Sacred words became associated with death. Prayers became tactical orders. The language our grandmothers taught us, the language that connected us to the earth and sky and everything holy, became a tool for destruction. It worked because our language was pure, untouched by outside influence. But we touched it with war, and it has never been the same for those of us who spoke it in battle. I ask that future generations remember not just our success, but our sacrifice. And I ask that they consider carefully before ever asking someone to turn their sacred language into a code again." 2. The Tribal Council discussed the letter in closed session. No official response was ever released. But in 2017, when the military approached the Navajo Nation about potentially developing a new code based on Navajo for modern digital warfare, the request was quietly declined. The official reason given was that there were not enough fluent speakers remaining to make it viable. But those close to the decision said the real reason was simpler and more profound. The elders remembered what it had cost the first time. They remembered the suicides, the alcoholism, the veterans who died speaking battle code in their sleep, the men who could never pray in their own language again without hearing artillery fire. Some wounds, they decided, were not worth reopening, no matter how effective the weapon. Today, there are monuments to the code talkers across the United States. In Window Rock, Arizona, A bronze statue shows a Navajo Marine in full combat gear, holding a radio, his face set in determination. In Washington, D.C., there's a display at the Pentagon honoring their contribution. Schools teach children about how an unwritten language became an unbreakable code. It's a story of American ingenuity, of cultural pride, of victory against impossible odds. But here's what those monuments don't show: the code talkers who came home and could never fully come home. The veterans who heard battle transmissions in their grandmother's lullabies. The men who chose silence over speaking because every word in Navajo carried the weight of coordinates that had sent fire down on human beings. The warriors who saved a nation by sacrificing something essential about themselves. The code was never broken by the enemy. But something in the code talkers was broken, quietly, permanently, in ways that even they didn't fully understand until it was too late. There's a place in Canyon de Chelly, on the Navajo reservation, where some of the surviving code talkers used to gather in the years before they died. It's not marked on any map, not designated as a memorial, just a spot under an ancient cottonwood tree where the canyon walls rise red and eternal against the sky. They would sit there, these old men with their fading tattoos and their careful silence, and they would speak in Navajo. Not the code, just the language as it had been before the war. Simple words about the weather, about their grandchildren, about the crops and the rain and the endless turning of seasons. A park ranger named Daniel Tso, himself Navajo, sometimes saw them there in the early 2000s. He never approached, never interrupted, but he watched from a distance with the respect due to elders. He said they looked like men trying to reclaim something they had lost, trying to separate the sacred from the tactical, trying to hear their own language the way their ancestors had heard it, clean and pure and untouched by war. They were doing ceremony, Tso said. Not in the formal sense, but ceremony nonetheless. They were trying to heal their language, to cleanse it of what the war had made it become. I don't know if they ever succeeded, but they kept coming back, year after year, fewer each time, until finally no one came anymore. The last of the original 29 code talkers, Joe Vandiver, died in 2021. He was 96 years old. In his final interview, conducted just months before his death, he was asked what he wanted people to remember about the code talkers. He was silent for a long time, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes distant with memories that spanned 8 decades. "Remember," he finally said, "that we did what needed to be done. Remember that our language saved lives. Remember that we were Marines, and we served with honor. But also remember." And here his voice dropped to barely a whisper, that some gifts cannot be given back. Once you use something sacred for war, it is marked forever. We marked our language with blood and death and victory. We don't regret it, but we carry it still, all of us who remain. And when we're gone, the code will live on in museums and history books. But the weight of it, the real cost of it, that dies with us. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some truths are too heavy to pass on. 3 weeks after that interview, Joe Vandiver passed away in his sleep. His family found him in his bed, peaceful, finally at rest. But on the nightstand next to him was a tape recorder, still running, the cassette spinning silently. His daughter, Maria, played it back, hoping he might have left some final message. What she heard was 15 minutes of her father speaking in Navajo. Not to anyone in particular, not a message for his family or a prayer for his journey. It was code, coordinates, tactical reports, requests for artillery support, battle damage assessments, the language of war that had lived in him for 79 years, finally transmitting one last time into the empty air of a bedroom on the Navajo reservation, where no one was listening, where no enemy would hear, where the words fell like rain on ancient stone and disappeared into silence. The tape still exists, locked away by the family. They've never released it publicly. Maria will only say, "It's private. It's between my father and whatever he was fighting in those final moments." Some wars don't end when the shooting stops. Some wars live inside you and speak through you until the very end. His war finally ended that night. He's at peace now. That's enough. But is it enough? Because here's the question that haunts everyone who truly understands the Code Talker's story. What does it mean when a language becomes a weapon? What happens to the people who speak that language when every word is loaded with the memory of death? The Code Talkers won the war. No one disputes that. They saved thousands of lives. They helped defeat an empire. They proved that their language, their culture, the very things that had been deemed worthless by the government, were actually invaluable. But they also proved something darker, that anything can be weaponized. Even the most sacred things. Even the words your grandmother taught you. Even the prayers your ancestors spoke. Everything has its price, and sometimes that price is paid not in blood or treasure, but in something more subtle and permanent. The loss of innocence, the corruption of the sacred, the transformation of language from a connection to your people into a memory of how efficiently you could call death from the sky. The code was unbreakable, but the men who spoke it were not. And in the end, maybe that's the real lesson. Not that we found the perfect weapon, but that every weapon extracts a cost from those who wield it. The Code Talkers understood that cost. They paid it willingly. They would do it again if asked. But they also want you to know, these men who are nearly all gone now, these warriors who carried their burden with dignity and silence for so long, that victory is complicated, that heroism can coexist with trauma, that you can save the world and still lose something essential about yourself in the process. They want you to remember their sacrifice, all of it, not just the glory, but the price. Because the code that couldn't be broken was spoken by men whose spirits were fractured by the very success of their mission. And that paradox, that terrible, beautiful, heartbreaking paradox, is the real story of the Navajo Code Talkers. It's the story that doesn't fit neatly into monuments or textbooks. It's the story that makes you uncomfortable because it forces you to confront the cost of what we ask our warriors to do, especially when we ask them to weaponize the most intimate, most sacred parts of who they are. The Navajo language is still spoken today on the reservation and beyond. Children learn it in schools. Elders teach it to grandchildren. It survives, resilient and beautiful, carrying with it thousands of years of wisdom, poetry, prayer, and connection to the land. But somewhere in that language, invisible to those who didn't serve, are the ghosts of coordinates and casualty reports, of tactical frequencies and artillery calculations. The Code Talkers put them there, not by choice but by necessity. And those ghosts remain, haunting the spaces between words, reminding us that language is never just language. It's memory. It's identity. It's the sum of everything we've used it for, good and terrible alike. The last transmission has been sent. The final Code Talker has gone to join his brothers. The code itself is now history, declassified, studied, celebrated. But somewhere in the red deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, in the canyons where the ancient ones left their marks on stone, the wind still carries echoes of young men speaking sacred words into radios while the world burned around them. And if you listen carefully, if you truly listen, you might hear not just the heroism, but the cost. Not just the victory, but the sacrifice that went beyond flesh and bone into the very essence of language and spirit and self. They saved us all, and it broke them in ways we are only beginning to understand. Remember that. Honor that. Because that's the whole truth, and the dead have earned the right to have their whole truth told. And so I ask you now, seek God, seek Jesus Christ, seek the peace that these warriors never fully found on earth. Seek the understanding that their sacrifice was not just physical, but spiritual, a giving up of something sacred for the protection of others. In that, there is a reflection of a greater sacrifice, a greater love. Let their story remind you that some wounds can only be healed by faith, by grace, by something beyond what this world can offer. The code talkers carried their burden to the grave, but they also carried hope that future generations would understand, would remember, and would seek a higher truth in the midst of war's darkness. Their language saved a nation. Their faith, carried through impossible trials, points us toward salvation. Remember them, honor them, and seek the God they prayed to when the code finally fell silent, and only the truth remained.